Hello there, and welcome to All 24 News special coverage on Russia-Ukraine file, coming to you live from Algiers with me, Karim Zachary. The war in Ukraine is in its 48th day. The country is accusing its Russian neighbor of the aftermath of this military operation. Fighting has caused thousands of deaths, millions displaced, and multiple cities destroyed. The special intervention, which began on the 24th of February, led the Western nations to support Ukraine and stand together against Russia. Ukrainian President Zelensky embraced the West that helped weaponize his country. His allies have also imposed severe sanctions on Russia. Among the latest are economic measures to ban new investment in Russia, severe sanctions on two Russian financial institutions, Alfa Bank and Sberbank, as well as sanctions on critical major state-owned enterprises. How is Russia reacting to these sanctions? Would President Vladimir Putin consider the severity of the consequences of these sanctions on his country and withdraw his troops from Ukraine? Such questions and more are raised in this tense situation between Russia and Ukraine. Our panel of guests will answer some of these questions through their own analysis. We have via Skype Dr. George Mshidlishvili, Associate Professor at Tbilisi State University from Georgia, and also Dr. Hisham Mnawar, writer and international relations researcher from Turkey. Thank you both gentlemen for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we start our discussion, let me share with you, dear guests, this piece of info. The Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby stated on a press conference that Russia is repositioning its forces near the Ukrainian eastern city of Donbass. Ukrainian authorities stated also that Russia is preparing for launching a wider range attack, as a convoy of Russian vehicles had been observed heading towards the town of Izium, about 180 kilometers north of the city of Donetsk. Let me start with you, Dr. George Mshidlishvili. How do you read these Western allegations? Do you believe that Russia is preparing for a wider range attack on Ukraine indeed?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It seems that Russia has been regrouping. Of course, it cannot swallow this unconditional defeat. One can say it was defeat because its initial goal was to occupy the entire Ukraine, to take Kiev within a matter of days, and then install the puppet regime. So these goals failed miserably. Now they need something to sell to their population. Therefore, they will like to solidify their current grip on Donbass and possibly take some chunk of the so-called Ukraine proper. Well, of course, Donbass is also internationally recognized Ukraine territory, but it has been occupied by Russia for nearly 8 years. So therefore, Russia tries to snatch as much as possible. Now its military potential has been depleted significantly, but with the remaining resources and relying on its allies like Belarus, whose support has been mostly political, but in military terms so far very, 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 very partial. So it tries to regroup and launch another massive attack. Looks like the Russia is preparing for serious assault because that's the only way for Russia to save face.
Indeed. What about you, Dr. Hisham منور? What are your analysis on this war in general? And how do you read the escalating tensions between the two poles and their allies?
First of all, thank you for having me today, and thank you for your channel and for your viewers. I think after 48 days of this operation, Russian operation in Ukraine, and trying to changing the regime, let's say, as the President Putin said before, I think the main goals or aims for this operation didn't reach or didn't Russia have all the goals that she wanted in the beginning. So they changed their strategy to, let's say, focus more on the east and southeast on the main and original goals of this operation, which was, as Kremlin said in the beginning of 24th of February, protecting the people of Donbass, as they said. So now they are back to the first, let's say, goal or aim of this operation. They are trying to control now and seize control of Mariupol. There are claims now that there is chemical attacks now in Mariupol to finish all the resistance in this city. But the main goal of this operation will be taking over or controlling over the all lands of Donetsk and Lugansk republics, which claimed independence and recognized only by Russia, and maybe seize more lands from the east, trying to put the Ukrainian delegation in the negotiations, put more pressure on them to force them to sign an agreement that Russia wants to neutralize Ukraine from all the let's say, NATO organization, EU organization, try to send Ukraine back to the, let's say, Russian backyard area or zone, trying to make to stop this war, but on their terms. So we should, let's say, we should facing, or we should consider that in the coming few days we will see more fighting, we will see more bombing and shelling bombs on the eastern Ukrainian cities, regardless if it is supporting the Ukrainian army or with Russia, because Russia now is in hurry to finish this war before the 9th of May, which is the day of their defeating the Nazis in the Second World War.
Very well indeed. And in related news, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on his last statement pleaded Kiev's Western allies to provide him with more weapon aid, as Russia was seen repositioning its forces near the east of Ukraine.
Supplying the necessary weapons to Ukraine means not only saving the lives of our people, not only giving us the opportunity to liberate our cities, especially Mariupol, which has suffered for so long, but also saving other states and other regions in the face of the new deployment of Russian aggression.
Still with you, Dr. Hisham Mnawar. Do you think Ukraine's plea for more weapons is legitimate, or is there another reason behind it?
I think any country in the world who has been attacked from one of the largest armies in the world and one of the countries who has a veto rights in the Security Council at UN, I think he has all the rights. It has all of the rights to reclaim for more weapons, all kinds of weapons. But the real question is, do these weapons allow Ukraine to reach a happy, let's say, happy path for this war, or a happy end for this war? I don't think they will put a good end for this war, because Russia will not stop until they achieve their goals in Ukraine, which is neutralizing Ukraine, neutralizing the Ukrainian army, make Ukraine somehow not joining NATO organization, make it like a country who depends more and more on Russia. I think this conflict is originally between Russia from one side and NATO from the other side. Ukraine is just a ground for this war, but it is not related to it. I think even if Ukraine needs more weapons to face the Russian operation on their lands, they will not risk to, let's say, lose their capital, which is Kiev, to go east and south and face the Russian army and the rebels, let's say, in the east. So they are between two fires. They cannot go east and southeast to face the Russian army, which is now focusing more in the east and southeast in Donbas region. And in the same time, they cannot leave the capital without guarding, because in any time Russia can send more forces from Belarus and attack the capital, which means losing the capital and maybe losing the whole war.
Very nice indeed. Dr. George Mshidlishvili, the West is supporting Ukraine and accepting Zelensky's plea for weapons, i.e., Russia's military operation was in protest of Ukraine being in the embrace of the West and being more weaponized in the first place. How do you think Russia is going to react to this? Why is the situation getting more and more tense? And there is no efforts recently to de-escalate.
Well, in this regard, when it comes to de-escalation, the ball is certainly on the Russia's court. Russia started this war, this unprovoked assault, and therefore Russia can't stop it, because if Russia stops fighting, there will be no war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no Ukraine, because for Ukraine, there is no choice. Ukraine is defending itself. And I think very much depends now on the resolve of the West, United States, NATO, European allies, how resolute they are in supporting Ukraine in its quest to join West. Well, Ukraine has had many domestic problems. Its path to democratization, modernization wasn't, of course, perfect, but it is a desire of the majority of its population. And when it comes to, of course, at some point, all wars end, but at the end of the war, Ukrainians, almost all Ukrainians, will be Russia's sworn enemies after these terrible and massive atrocities and war crimes that Russia has committed in Ukraine over the past 48 days. It's pretty much impossible for Ukraine to become Russia's ally, even neutral. So Russia could secure several military victories in order to force a prostrate Ukraine to a peace on the Russian term. But in this regard as well, very much depends on the West. The West, NATO, European countries, United States, UK, Poland, and Baltic states, who have been very vocal, the latter several countries have been very vocal and very resolute in their support of Ukraine. They are in the position to supply Ukraine with the weaponry sufficient to deter Russia, to defend from the Russian aggression, and to win this war. It is possible for Ukraine, not alone, of course, but with the Western support. Well, there could be no draw. It seems that this is a really kind of zero-sum game for Russia and Ukraine and the West. So Russia will not stop until it gets something, but Ukraine, with the help of the West, is in the position to deny Russia its goal. And of course, it will be the beginning of I think the beginning of the end of Putin's regime was February 24th, but it will be the second stage of the end of this terrible leadership in Russia and the beginning of Russian normalization. I believe that the only salvation for Russia itself, it will be something akin to Nuremberg process, or it will be in Hague, probably it will be held in Hague, or for all the war crimes and that this regime committed, and it will be the beginning of the normalization of Russia. I view generally, in the long term, I view this development positively, but very unfortunately, in the short term, we are in for more victims, more fatalities, and potentially more war crimes. But again, the West is capable of stopping it, is capable of supplying Ukraine with weapons sufficient to strike back.
Thank you indeed. Moving on now, his visit to Moscow, a first from a European leader since Russia started its military operation in Ukraine. The Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer described his meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow as a no optimism. Let's listen.
I have no optimistic impression that I can bring you from this conversation with President Putin. The offensive is obviously being massively prepared, but therefore also the clear commitment that a stable access to the International Red Cross is needed.
I get back to you, Dr. George Mshidlashvili. I mean, as you stated earlier, this is an obvious hint that the situation is not going to let up, that is, and de-escalate. So is the West re-evaluating where the new red lines are as the war enters a new stage? Dr. George?
Well, Russian assault determined the new red lines, though the red lines are Ukraine should be defended. And, Ukraine should restore its territorial integrity. Unfortunately, there is a possibility that Russia will get away with something. Well, it looks like Crimea is out of the table for some time, not for good, hopefully, but for years or decades to come. Again, Russia is capable of keeping control on the Donbass, but Russia should be denied any further incursions and neutralization of Ukraine. So, the guest colleague mentioned Mariupol. Russia's strategic victory would be this land bridge between the Donbass and Crimea. So their fair defense of Mariupol, however unlikely and improbable it is now, however beleaguered are the defenders, again, there should be, I guess, still the confirmation of Russia using the ring, very poisonous gas. So again, there will be next stage, and the red line is defending Ukraine, and as I told before, the West is capable of doing that.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Hisham Mnawar, this is a recurrent question. Why is the West trying to demonize Russia while many atrocities were committed previously by the US and other Western nations? I mean, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, we have many examples. The West is surely accused of having a double standard when dealing with such matters. What's your take on this?
That's a really good question. I agree with you. It's just only the double standards that push the Western, let's say, camp involving EU, UK, USA to just condemn the Russian aggression in Ukraine and nothing saying a word about what happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria,
Palestine, Western Sahara,
Palestine, of course.
Yes.
Yes. The list is endless. So what we see in Ukraine now is just because the war happens in Europe and concerned the Europeans and the Western countries, now the whole world should now do the solidarity with the Ukrainian people, which we do also. We don't deny that the Ukrainian people are suffering now from this war. More than 4 million refugees now fled to the other countries. In general, 10 million displaced or fled to the other countries, which make Ukrainian crisis one of the fastest crises in the world, in the modern world. Before it was Syria, who has more than 10 million displaced and refugees, but in 10 years, Russia made them just into less than 2 months. And now the West is just trying to put and let's say assembly all the country in the world just to condemn this aggressive and this operation. But in the same time, when the Western country trying to do the same in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq, in Palestine, nobody says anything about that. So what we see now is double standards, and what we know for sure that this war is not between Russia and Ukraine for sure. It's between Russia trying to come back to the international stage, saying that you need to consider or reconsider my security needs on my borders and not to extend the NATO borders toward my backyard. This is what Russia said in the beginning, but NATO since 2021 refused to sit with Russia in the same table, refused to discuss Russia worries about extending let's say, the NATO towards the east and trying to grab more lands in the benefit of Russia. So what can Russia in the end doing in that war? At the end, Russia was convinced that there is no solution to stop NATO and stop EU from expanding and extending their lands onto the east unless they go to the war. But the question is, the Western is still, let's say, certain that weaponizing Ukraine will stop this war. I disagree with this point of view because I don't think the war should goes on and more civilians and casualties will have every day. I think we should sit all to the table. We should negotiate and put an end for this war as soon as possible because either let's say the sanctions, the economic sanctions, imposing more sanctions, and now EU is preparing the sixth, let's say, package of these sanctions on Russia. Even the sanctions is like shooting on the food. We all know that the whole world are getting more hunger. The whole world now is struggling with this war because the inflation, the food prices increasing.
The repercussion of the war, of course, is global and it touches everyone. I mean, all countries included, even in Middle East and in North Africa. I would like to hear the opinion of George Mshidlishvili regarding the double standards of the West. Dr. George Mshidlishvili, why don't we see the same resolve, for example, of the United States when it comes to protecting the areas or the borders of other nations or the sovereignty of other nations? We have the example of Western Sahara, for example, with Morocco. We have the example of the Golan Heights, I mean, with Syria and the Zionist entity. The same thing for the occupied Palestine. What do you have to say about this, Dr. George?
Okay, so thank you for letting me talk about this issue with which I have some disagreement with the
yes, of course.
Well, in the first place, when talking about double standards, yes, invasion of Iraq was criminal mistake. Afghanistan 20 years was a major disaster with the very ignominious retreat. But you know, the reason, the difference is all those perpetrators of Iraq, they paid at least a political price. Those people who did excesses in Abu Ghraib prison, okay, they got the prison term. So therefore, in those societies, there is a discussion. Those people are very seriously criticized and reprimanded. So they suffer reputational losses. They pay a reputation price at least, and political price, and sometimes, okay, the loss of freedom. So there is a difference between Russia in this regard and the United States. In Russia, so those the war crime perpetrators, they are lionized. So for 20 plus years, when Russia became revisionist and so aggressive, so all these aggressive moves toward its neighbors are lauded rather than criticized. So therefore, there is no political spectrum in Russia. Actually, there is no virtual normal opposition to criticize the moves of the state. Unlike the United States, well, if you be it CNN, be it Fox, be it conservative, being liberal, we see the criticism of the current government, be it Democratic or Republican. So in this particular regard, there is a considerably more discussion. And again, as I told you, people pay political prices. Well, with regard to the Golan Heights, again, we are not going back into history. I believe that it was a defensive action on the part of Israel to secure its border, because in the 50s, in the 60s, there have been a number of attacks on Israel from the north and from the south, and therefore it was rather defensive. Yes, not all actions of the Jewish states are always perfect, but they are guided primarily by this care of their citizens and their security. However, okay, so imperfect they might seem. And well, when it comes to this NATO expansion and Russia seeing it as an existential threat, I think that causality here is different. Starting from mid-90s of the last century, Russia started revisionist policies. So it replaced its liberal and more democratically minded leaders, I mean leaders and like key actors, by militaristic, KGB related security type of like guys who, and Cold War rhetoric was back in Russian like political discourse by already late 90s. Putin is just the just a fruition of the process which started like in mid 90s. So therefore, seeing increasingly the revisionist Russia, first in rhetoric and then in action, which actually culminated in the Munich speech of 2007, which was actually kind of just like statement of revisionism. Countries, Central and Eastern European countries, and then the Baltic states saw no choice but to join NATO, something they didn't have in mind in the very early 90s. So therefore, it was Russia's actions which spurred that drive towards NATO, first in Eastern Central European countries and later in the Baltic Sea and late in Georgia and Ukraine. I myself, as a Georgian citizen, I believe that NATO protection is the only solution. Well, with the NATO membership not on the table, I believe kind of the keys of Georgia's security are in the United States until Brussels, be it the European Union and NATO, becomes like more coherent and accepts Georgia. So I believe it's Russia's actions which push Georgia and Ukraine towards NATO, as it pushed Baltic states 2 decades ago and Eastern European countries 2.5 decades ago.
Very clear. Thank you very much. President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia could resort to chemical weapons as it massed troops in the eastern Donbas region for a new assault on Mariupol. And verified reports from the besieged southern port cities Azov troop said a poisonous substance of unknown origin was released, causing breathing issues, respiratory failure. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said her department is working with partners to verify the claims, and she vowed to hold Putin to account over the potential attack. I get back to you, Dr. Hisham Mnawar. What could the West do more to punish Russia? What is UK promising to do against Russia here?
First of let me get back to our guest and my friend George, which said that only NATO and joining NATO now is the only way to protect both Georgia and Ukraine from this, let's say, scenario, what's happening now in Ukraine. We all remember in 2008 what happened to Georgia when the Russian army attacked for helping South Ossetia, and nobody helped Georgia in that time, and even NATO didn't do anything to help Georgian people against Russia. So why we should be so sure that NATO and EU will support the countries, such countries like in east of Europe, like Ukraine, like Georgia, like other countries who want to join NATO organization, when we have many historical proofs that NATO won't do that. The real question now in the West is, are you ready to fight for Russia, for Ukraine? I don't think any country in the NATO now are ready is ready to fight Russia, because they know exactly what does it mean to be in war with Russia now. So that's why we see the Kremlin, we see the Russian army are so confident that they will reach their aims. Unfortunately, of course, they will reach their aims because there is no country, no army in Europe and in the Western camp is ready to fight against Russia.
So nobody is daring enough, nobody is bold enough actually to face Russia face to face. And of course, this direct clash between Russia and NATO will cause a dramatic actually consequences. Perhaps Dr. George would like to get back to you, since we have only 1 minute left in this debate, and perhaps in coming editions we will discuss further. Dr. George? Yes. Perhaps you would like to get back to Hisham Mnawar on what he said?
Okay, NATO. Yes, in 2008, the West forgave Russia, even though I would say that there was support towards Georgia, political, economic, rehabilitational support, and actually Russian troops stopped advancing toward Tbilisi. They were about 40 kilometers, like 25, 30 miles, like from the gates of the capital, when American ship entered the Bosphorus. Well, and from the Bosphorus already like heading like towards the Black Sea it was a military ship on a humanitarian mission. That was a clear message to Russia that, well, they should leave the capital and the entirety of like Georgia alone. I don't know whether Russia was planning actually to occupy the whole Georgia, but the fact is they stopped that at once there was a news about U.S. ship. Well, I think we see recently when the country is willing to defend itself, it gets support from the West.
I think it's clear enough, Dr. George. Thank you so much, Dr. George, since we ran out of time. Thank you so much for both guests, Hisham, Mnawar, George Mshidlishvili. Thank you, dear viewers, for tuning in to our channel. That's the end of our special coverage for today. Tomorrow, we will meet you again with a different edition. Thank you so much, and bye for now.